Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'd like to thank the C20 Summit organizers for the opportunity to participate today and all of you for joining us. My name is Louisa Tomar, and I'm a program officer at the Center for International Private Enterprise based in Washington, D.C. CIPE works at the intersection of economic and democratic development. Democratizing opportunity is really about inclusion, and the technological transformation underway requires that entrepreneurs, small business owners, women, and marginalized communities have a voice in shaping the policies that impact their lives and their livelihoods. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the persistent gaps in digital and financial inclusion. This panel will cover existing efforts to improve digital and financial inclusion, opportunities to increase access to the digital economy, especially in developing countries, and share recommendations that G20 governments can prioritize into their response to COVID-19 and economic recovery, and importantly, resiliency. Before we get started, a bit of housekeeping. Please write any questions or comments into the Q&A chat box, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can in the final 20 to 25 minutes of the discussion. I will first briefly introduce the panelists and then turn it over to each of them for 5 minutes to discuss their work a bit more in depth. So this morning, I'm honored to have with us Anthea Haryoko. She is the head of external relations at the Center for Indonesian Policy Studies. CHIPS is a think tank based in Jakarta that advocates for practical policy reform and is currently doing an assessment of Indonesia's digital economy policy environment. Next is Amit Sharma. He's the president and CEO of Inclusive, a startup focused on reducing the barriers to financial inclusion. Inclusive makes it easy for customers and clients to meet comprehensive compliance obligations so more people can access commercial capital and credit markets. We're also joined by Lourdes Montenegro. She's the lead of the digital sector transformation at the World Benchmarking Alliance. Lourdes leads the Digital Inclusion Benchmark, which tracks how companies are meeting the Sustainable Development Goals and achieving a more inclusive digital economy and society. Lastly, we have with us my colleague, Rondal Zogby. She is CIPE's country director for Egypt. She has inspired much of our thinking at CIPE on the issue of financial and digital inclusion through her work in Egypt on the cashless economy. Due to unforeseen circumstances, Rhonda will be joining us without turning her video on, but I thank you all for understanding. So allow me to turn it over to Anthea to get started and talk a bit more about their work in Indonesia. Thank you.
Thanks, Louisa, for the kind introduction. Let me just quickly share my screen. So I hope that's visible to everybody. Okay, so I just wanted to introduce the Center for Indonesian Policy Studies to everybody here. We often refer to as CHIPS because C is pronounced with a ch in Indonesia, so we're like fish and chips, but to an international audience, you can just call us CIPS. Basically what we are is that we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy think tank. We don't align with any political interest group or party. And our role in civil society here is to bridge the academic knowledge and evidence and analyze it, conduct policy analysis and package it in a way that is understandable for a policy-making audience. So our role is to recommend policy changes in order to expand the opportunities for low-income Indonesians. And that is ultimately our larger mission at CIPS, to build prosperity and wealth for all Indonesians. And so the issue of digital economy and digital inclusion is especially interesting for us because we see some very interesting economic opportunities that have arisen out of a lot of the digital innovations. And often these are homegrown digital innovations we see in Indonesia. and how they might be able to impact or provide opportunities for the informal sector, the micro, small enterprises, and the entrepreneurial ecosystem in general in Indonesia. So we're here to analyze the policies that are in place, assess the landscape of the digital economy in Indonesia, and promote the policies that would support more inclusive growth so that certain groups are not disadvantaged or left out from this, from the opportunities that have arisen from the digital economy in Indonesia. So that is CIPS in a nutshell, and I look forward to discussing more in this panel.
Thank you so much, Amcia. I'd like to turn it over to Amit to discuss a bit more about FinClusive.
Wonderful. My apologies there. So I'm Amit Sharma. Thank you for that wonderful intro and for having us today. As you can see from our name, FinClusive, we are a firm dedicated to financial inclusion. We're a hybrid financial technology and regulatory technology. And our process, our systems, our strategy is really informed by 15, 20 plus years in the security and compliance related issues that have been growing challenges in financial services access globally. Goes without saying, but there are billions, arguably 2.5 to 3.5 billion people on the planet that don't have access to basic financial services, and that is disproportionately geared towards low, moderate income, global poor countries, women, minorities, and immigrant and migrant populations in international marketplaces. However, that statistic is actually undercutting an even larger problem that we have, and that is also organizationally, nonprofits to small, medium enterprises. 90+% of global job growth is in the small and medium enterprise sector. And if we think about the access that small, medium enterprises, entrepreneurial ventures, especially in the emerging and frontier markets, the access to basic financial services, credit, lending, and other forms of working capital to start and grow small businesses is the lifeblood. And so doing so now in an increasingly digitized digital economy is essential. The COVID pandemic has certainly exacerbated that plight for many, both small business support and individuals that benchmark on it. Now, the growth in anti-money laundering cannot be ignored here because, in fact, many institutions, traditional banks in particular, have looked at many of these enterprises, low, moderate income countries, global poor, as high risk. And when they do the cost-benefit analysis, they say, well, it's just not worth doing the business. And that incentivizes this concept of de-risking. And so certain types of clients and activities are disproportionately impacted and therefore pushed out of the system or denied financial services. But traditional compliance is challenging, it's redundant, it's inefficient, and needs a modernized approach. Importantly, the growth in non-traditional, non-bank financial technologies and ecosystems provides us a huge opportunity to drive inclusion because you really have 85, 90% cell phone and even smartphone penetration rates in some of the most rural and frontier corners of this planet. So we now have the ability to bring that kind of financial access digitally. What's important is we need to do it through human-centric technologies that are absorbable. Importantly, we have to provide that access in ways that are secure, that provide businesses and individuals the security in knowing that their personal identifying information and their financial transactions and engagements are secure. So it remains important to address compliance, and global regulators recognize this. And so they're increasing scrutiny in these new financial ecosystems, be they peer-to-peer, mobile, blockchain-enabled, virtual and digital assets, or the crypto economy. Many of these engagements provide tremendous opportunities for inclusion, provided we provide the appropriate compliance controls. And so these alternative financial ecosystems, coupled with traditional, with the compliance regime, is the strategy that we undertake. In FinClusive, given what I just described, we have what we call a compliance as a service platform, which is a modernized financial crimes compliance, anti-money laundering, know your customer, due diligence, and security and monitoring platform. And it's provided, it's created for its equal access to traditional institutions, small and medium banks, as well as modern fintech companies and cross-border payments and non-bank financial institutions. By doing this, we can then provide access for those organizations, individuals, to a growing roster of US banks of record, that can now offer them deposit and custodial services in insured accounts. So if you go back to the basics of finance, can I store value securely? We can provide that access to individuals and entities, no matter where located, in US institutions, FDIC insured. That allows you to store that value securely. And then transfer that value securely. The ability to make payments, provide for remittances, which are 3 to 4 times official development assistance, and really in many emerging and frontier markets, the lifeblood for many individuals and households, as well as small, medium businesses. And by doing so, connecting new financial ecosystems, peer-to-peer value transfer and other non-bank channels with some of the traditional, in a compliance regime, you can provide that financial access. At the end of the day, we care about building financial health, because if we are truly working to build economic resilience, leveraging new technologies for that access, ensuring that that access is safe, secure, and transparent, and then providing that access in ways that anyone or any organization can access it, that's part of bringing economic resilience to organizations and households alike. I welcome your questions and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Amit, for bringing up the issues of balancing risk with access. And now I'll ask Lourdes to tell us a bit more about World Benchmarking Alliance and her work there.
Thank you very much, Louisa, and especially to SIPE for inviting us to this panel. We're very pleased to join the C20 Summit, representing the World Benchmarking Alliance. Let me just take a bit of time to share my slide. Perhaps a bit of background before I begin further. The World Benchmarking Alliance is a global initiative that was created as an accountability mechanism for the corporate sector on their SDG contribution. So it's really all about encouraging more private sector contribution to sustainable development. We work around this concept of 7 systems transformation. We look at different industries, or what we call systems. We have food, we have urban, we have circular manufacturing, we have climate, we have finance, we have the social system, and of course we have the digital system. And the idea and philosophy behind it is, when we think about digital contribution, the contribution of digital technology companies, we need to bring it closer back to their core business. And what they contribute in terms of sustainable development is really around making sure that there is digital inclusion. And not only that, that this access to digital technologies includes as well the promotion of trustworthy use, which includes mitigation of risks and harms. So at the World Benchmarking Alliance, we are working and primarily on the publication of free and publicly available benchmarks, committed to benchmarking up to 2,000 companies by 2023. And for the digital sector, we are publishing the first round of the digital inclusion benchmark this December. Very exciting. It covers 100 of the world's most influential digital technology companies, from Adobe to ZTE. We have a lot of the big names in there, as well as the less well-known but systematically influential actors in the system. So we've looked at digital inclusion essentially in broadly as being made up of 4 areas. So you have improving access, enhancing skills, fostering trust in order to increase beneficial use, and not only that, to ensure that innovation is open and as well as ethical, and making sure that everyone benefits equally from the digital economy. So we are, our discussion today, we're very excited about it. It's very much in line with this year's, the theme of this year's G20 presidency, which is really realizing opportunities of the 21st century for all. So part of that realization of these 21st century opportunities is really about digital and financial inclusion, and making sure that these truly help us with recovery after the COVID-19 pandemic and building a more resilient world. I'll stop there, and then looking forward to our discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Lourdes. And now I'm going to ask my colleague Rhonda to talk a bit more about her work in Egypt, and I'm going to share her slides for her. So one moment while I do so.
I've been working on Site Egypt program for the last 25 years, and I can say with confidence that the key challenges with are related to weak, ineffective, and non-functioning institutional structures. At site and in Egypt, as like my main experiences is the MENA region and primarily Egypt, we understand that building institutions or reforming the current institutions is a long-term process. It's not limited to changing the public policies, but also involves changing practices and taking the local social norms and long inherited practices into consideration. Um, Many of the barriers is in the practices, not in the legal frameworks. This needs patience, policy design iterations while we're implementing any of the programs, whether pre-COVID or post-COVID. We identify local moral leadership who are able to address adaptive challenges, and we need to identify the wider community. We want them engaged in our program and in our value system to adapt our moral values. We're doing this since 2014 with the issue of financial inclusion, and we will come back later in this session while you are moderating the panel to discuss financial inclusion in more details. Many countries started bridging the digital gap in the last few years through investing in the digital infrastructure, cybersecurity, and digital governance. And the level of a country preparedness before the pandemic was determinant in its success to address the pandemic. Egypt is one of the good examples here. Actually, we were lucky. The government started since 2004 in the building the ICT infrastructure. So when we faced the pandemic, we were already ready and prepared at, it was a decent level of preparedness. So actually the pandemic did not add to the issues, but it accelerated financial inclusion, automation, and the digital transformation. It was a plus, it wasn't a negative point.
So thank you so much, everyone, for sharing a bit about your work. I'd now like to take the time to have a discussion about this very important issue. So the first question I'd like to throw out to the panelists, and perhaps starting with you, Anthea, is how is the digital economy linked with the post-pandemic global economic recovery?
Thanks, Louisa. So I think Indonesia has not been spared from the massive loss of employment that has been happening as a result of lockdowns and a slowing down of the economy. So, but for Indonesia specifically, the loss of jobs have impacted those in the sectors of service and hospitality, textiles and manufacturing. And these sectors are huge employers of lower income to low middle income Indonesians. So there is this definite threat or risk that more Indonesians will be pushed below the poverty line. So that's really scary for us to see. So where the digital economy comes into play here is that Indonesia's digital economy, actually, we are fortunate to have in the past couple of years built this incredible ecosystem of e-commerce platforms, fintech services, these delivery services app like your Ubers, and here it's called Gojek, and you have Grab here. So we have this opportunity for those who have lost incomes or have severely seen a reduction in household incomes to use these platforms to create perhaps a small shop or a small business. And they have they're offering these, not offering, but they provide these opportunities for people to recover or find new sources of income. And it's very interesting because the digital economy here in Indonesia at the moment, I read recently, it's worth $40 billion and is predicted to reach $130 billion by 2025. So you can just imagine the dynamism and the huge opportunities that the digital space provides for the economy, and not just the economy, but for for lower income Indonesians. And so I can also imagine that if the world manages to contain the pandemic, and if we are all back to normal, these sectors that were hiring, that were employing these people before, it's going to take a while for them to recover and to hire back the people that they had to let go. And so again, the opportunities through creating a business using digital platforms will be a crucial lifeline for millions, and to some extent will help kind of stave off the threat of poverty and offer this opportunity of inclusive growth in the future as well. So I think that's why we are very interested in the digital economy. Even outside of the COVID situation, there have been many opportunities for people to easily start a business. All you would need is a mobile device, for example, to open a store. And these digital platforms have made this very accessible because they know their markets. They're targeting those outside major cities. We're fortunate to have a decent mobile infrastructure, telecommunications infrastructures, at least in the major populated islands. And more people, as Amit has mentioned in his opening, smartphone penetration is really high in Indonesia. And so there are these incredible opportunities in the future and incredible opportunities for economic growth going ahead.
Thanks, Anthea. You bring up a good point about infrastructure and access to devices, which is a huge piece of open access to the digital economy. Amit, I want to turn it over to you to sort of build on this, how the digital economy is linked with post-pandemic recovery.
Well, absolutely. I think it's worth citing a couple quick statistics that in my opening remarks and Anthea and others have alluded to. Some of these issues are very systemic that have just been exacerbated by the COVID pandemic, right? So we talked a little bit about both individuals being underserved, financially excluded, and organizations. But importantly, Anthea made an interesting point that we need to just quickly reemphasize. Even in some of the most developed markets in the world, the US, Western Europe, right? Take the US, where essential workers, right? Food delivery, grocers, processing, social services, early childhood education, these are vital for all of society. And consistently in the United States, they are most often provided, 2/3 are provided by low, moderate income, women, minorities, and migrants. They are the most vulnerable when you think about financial access. Now, often we, especially with our hubris in the more developed economies, we tend to think this as, the global poor or low, moderate income populations outside of countries like the United States. But remittance corridors, where we have traditionally been net creditors to those international markets, we have seen a substantial reversal of said flows, especially to migrant populations in the United States. And so that is a vital lifeline that requires digitization, requires it, right? The third is in the context of all of our lives now are impacted by a forced move to digitization, right? So again, just take a developed nation's challenge here in the US. Some of the statistics pointed to more than 50% of individuals felt that they were unable to telecommute and did not have the ability to remote work, right? So if you think about the digitization of the economy, is essential not only for our day-to-day lives, whether we're directly impacted or not, but our ability to then carry on income generative activities in a way that we could not before. Now, with all of that in mind, to your point, when we think about the issues of financial infrastructure, Financial activities are no longer jurisdictionally bound, right? Financial services are cross-border. They have been, and regulation needs to catch up. And this is why we're taking this approach from a compliance perspective, because too often we cite anti-money laundering, financial system security, transparency as being the barrier for inclusion. But the financial system regulatory footprint, including the global standards for them that impact both traditional banks and increasingly new financial ecosystems, financial technologies, peer-to-peer value transfer, and the like, all are under increased scrutiny for compliance. And unless we solve that challenge in a modern way, we're not going to overcome that hurdle. Now, it's required. We have personal information, financial information that needs to be protected. We need to change the ethos of what we constitute as safety, security in the financial regulatory space to one of inclusion, not one of exclusion. And right now, financial system regulatory oversight is one based in exclusion. Think about the sensitive sectors, nonprofits. There was a wonderful panel earlier this week on nonprofits, the vital role nonprofits play internationally, and they're considered higher compliance risk by most major banks, right? So then small, medium enterprises, then individuals and households and the like. And so when we think about that access, we have to think about a human-centric, safe, secure access channel, leveraging the high penetration of digital access that we are seeing both at the household level and the business level. And thirdly, we now have the ability to provide that access in a secure way, providing access to tools around credit, lending, et cetera, for small businesses and households wherever located. That's the exciting challenge. And if we can couple that with a secure element, we're not only attacking literally a handful of very important sustainable development goals from the UN macro perspective, but really day-to-day challenges that are happening today. And so it just brings me back full circle. It is a protracted and long recovery that has been exacerbated by the COVID pandemic. But that exacerbation has had a disproportionate impact on low, moderate income, minority groups, migrants, who already have faced challenges in underbanked, underpaid, underinsured, and the like. And that is a universal and global challenge that we need to solve, but we can solve.
Thank you, Amit. I mean, you bring up such a good point that when we're talking about digital and financial inclusion, that we have to look broader than just thinking about developing countries. There are communities throughout the globe that are excluded from the financial system and regular access to internet. I'd like to turn it over to Lourdes to hear from her perspective what she's seeing at the sustainable development goals, and also in terms of how the private sector is viewing the digital economy for post-pandemic economic recovery.
Thanks, Louisa. The question of how the digital economy is going to affect post-COVID-19 resiliency and the role of the private sector is really very timely. We've seen that the pandemic has really brought back attention to issues of the digital divide. More than in any other year, we've realized suddenly in a very personal way that this is in fact a key issue. Whether or not the digital economy helps our recovery in a resilient way really depends on inclusion, whether we have digital inclusion, whether we have financial inclusion. So all those benefits, for example, that Antea was talking about in Indonesia can only be realized really if we ensure that technologies are accessible to everyone in an affordable way, in a universal way, in a way that fosters trust. And this is very important. Unfortunately, we're still a long way to go. And what we found from our initial work on ranking and scoring 100 of the world's most influential digital technology companies, these companies have global reach. They impact a lot of underserved communities, both in developed and developing countries. But what we are seeing are some alarming numbers. For example, we see a seeming lack of commitment or care for gender diversity still in technical roles, in R&D, essentially in the development of technology itself. So if we don't see that kind of diversity, we put at risk this idea that technology is for everyone if it's only designed by a select group of people. So we're finding, for example, that very few companies report women working in technical roles, less than a third of them actually. And when they do report, we see very low numbers. So only a fourth, for example, of technical roles would be, for example, women. And very few, only 4 companies in the 100 companies we're benchmarking this year actually report the number of women working in their research and development. There's a lot of other things. For example, if we think about big data as the new oil of the digital economy, if that oil is concentrated within a few powerful players, then we're not going to see that inclusion again. So, but what we're seeing is that only very few companies, around 19%, actually share their data sets publicly to academic institutions, to civil society, to governments who wish to use the data for socially beneficial research and applications. We're also seeing very few research and development happening in developing countries, even when they do have operations in those countries. We see very low commitments to specific issues such as child online safety. We only see 15%, and that's alarming. Only 15% of these 100 most powerful digital technology companies are actually clearly committed to child digital online safety. So we still clearly have a long way to go, and that's where the C20 summit and SIPE and Inclusive and CIPS can work together and partner, to create this environment to motivate, the digital sector to do more.
Thank you, Lourdes. I mean, that's so true that there needs to be a conversation between the largest technology companies, civil society, and the multi-stakeholder bodies that can help, build the norms and standards that can increase access and inclusion, but not just on the receiving end or the customer end, but also in who is developing these products and how they meet the needs of the end consumer. Thank you so much for that. So now I'd like to turn it over to Rhonda to speak a bit about this from her perspective.
Yeah, as I mentioned before, Louisa, the issue is about whether you're prepared or not. We see that the health of the economy before the COVID is impacting the battle against COVID, not vice versa. In Egypt, we accelerated the implementation of the digital measures. The central bank has issued new laws and regulations for banks. Banks made it very easy to open bank accounts, use mobile applications for payments. But we see that the pandemic made people more dependent on the digital tools. There was a shift in consumer behavior, and we think that the consumer behavior will not go back to the pre-pandemic consumption patterns. There will be new economic structures. It won't be a recovery where you go back to the pre-COVID. It will be a paradigm shift led by entrepreneurs and a responsive government. Number of fintechs in Egypt have increased like more than double. You see women using social media to, to sell and buy, and this was not seen before. The Ministry of Education accelerated its digital delivery program, which started 3 years ago, and parents were very resistant to move to online and e-learning. Now they have no choice but to, to respond to the ministry. So in fact, the pandemic helped the government programs through a consumer and the citizen who was reluctant to use digital tools. Now they are using it because they have to use it. the informal sector is coming in the mainstream and integrated with the formal through digital tools. So actually, it wasn't a bad thing, and I think that the economy will grow, not including economy for women, for the marginalized. Now you reach marginal areas and like remote areas, the underdeveloped regions, and without any biases. You don't know who you're dealing with. There's no discrimination against women or like social backgrounds or religious beliefs. It's making a very democratic business transactions. So, you know, it's a good thing. The corona turned to be good. It has a good side.
Thanks, Rhonda. You bring up a great point that, you know, with the pandemic, when people are forced to stay home during these lockdowns, that in some cases that is increasing inclusion and it's forcing people to move online. It's interesting to hear that even the informal economy has begun to do so in Egypt. And I hope that's a trend that will continue, because I think you're right. There will be, and there is undergoing a paradigm shift. So it's unlikely things will return back to how they were pre-COVID. So I'd like to now switch to the next question. So this, Amit, I would like you to answer this one. So why must digital and financial inclusion be priorities for achieving a just world? And what does that mean to you?
Thanks for the question. It's a hugely important, central to the discussion here. And I think Rhonda hit on a couple of those elements that really come from and are stemmed from already embedded systemic biases. So one point I just wanted to as part of that question that I wanted to emphasize, but take off of Rhonda's point. Think about the gender gap that Lourdes had talked about in engagement with financial services broadly, technology specifically. But there have been, since the pandemic really exacerbated itself in many markets, there has been a default, in fact, net exit by women from the formal economy because of the push to remote learning and the like. That's not good for anyone, right? And so we already had a systemic issue in gender inequality in the workplace, and you have many families therefore forced to make now these binary choices in an increased forced remote digital world. And unfortunately, many default to the women's traditional gender role as going back to ensuring that the households kept and taking themselves out of income generative opportunities. That can't stand. The second is, in terms of the inclusive global economy, we're forgetting a very important aspect of global job growth, right? Financial technology companies, but technology companies broadly, are not only working to deliver seamless, near real-time, cheaper, more cost and transaction efficient services to underserved communities. They're also employing them. Technology companies have a global footprint. So we no longer are bound jurisdictionally that way. So we can actually afford to and easily engage and employ individuals in multiple markets, regardless of where our home jurisdiction is and regardless of where our clients' counterparties are. And so that is a huge boon for driving inclusion, not just in terms of service delivery, but actually service creation. And that's an important thing. So job growth itself is really tied to this. From an inclusivity perspective, at the end of the day, we talked a little bit about the inherent biases that have plagued financial services, right? Low, moderate income, women, immigrants, minorities, et cetera, have been, unfortunately, in the disproportionately negatively impacted. What we have to be really careful about as we move forward with some of these advanced technologies, advanced analytics and the like, that we're not just taking legacy traditional data and now spinning up because of this machine learning and AI engine says, hey, I can now provide credit and lending services to these populations. If we're working off of old legacy biased data, we are going to have biased results and just exacerbate that problem. So in terms of broader inclusivity, we need to work from that side. And the final issue I would say to your question on why it's an important issue is twofold. My background is in the national security space. If we truly are wanting to build national and economic security, that starts with resilience. That means more people engaged in the formal economy, not less. And there's two inherent biases that we have to contend with, right? The first one is the bias against small, medium enterprise. That is a fact and continues to be exacerbated by these programs, including many governments like the USG. If we are looking at modernizing access, we need to have small and medium enterprises as part of the solution for delivery, not only the recipients of that delivery. And it cannot be dominated by the bulge bracket entities that end up having the cash flow, the resilience, the personnel footprint, et cetera, to dominate these economies. We have to actually engage proactively as a program, small and medium enterprises as part of the solution set in that regard. The good news is, by doing so, we're actually creating employment opportunities, financial access opportunities, cross-border opportunities for the most disproportionately impacted or marginalized from a financial services context. And by doing that, more access begets financial resilience, allows us to build financial and responsible health at the individual and household level, but also at the organizational level. And that inherently drives down systemic risk, increases transparency, and builds to our broader national security objectives. So too often we look at global growth or resilience in a binary way. Can I have safety and security, or can I have inclusion? And we would argue that you cannot have safety and security without a concerted impact and effect and drive for inclusion. And we need to be testing, auditing, and rewarding inclusive efforts as part of that resilience strategy, not simply as a trade-off or an ancillary benefit.
Thank you, Amit. Absolutely. And I think it's really important to continue to have conversations about bias and how that has disproportionately impacted people pre-financial, digital exclusion, financial exclusion, disproportionately impacted many communities. So I'm curious, Lourdes, from your perspective, especially looking at how larger private sector companies are handling this, how do you see it from the work you're doing at WBA?
Hi. So from our perspective, building on what Amit said, that we should actually reward inclusivity and efforts towards inclusion as part of our resilience strategy. That's essentially the reason for this benchmarking effort in itself. It's to recognize, it's to rank and score and motivate companies to do better and to do more for their communities. So that's essentially, once you have that data, once you measure something, you can manage it, and you can put that data in the hands of many civil society actors, governments, and most especially investors. So at the World Benchmarking Alliance, we work with more than 150 allies globally. Many of them are investors already reaching some 6 trillion assets under management. And the idea is that these different stakeholders, and in particular investors, should be ready to go out there and engage with the companies in their portfolio, should be ready to allocate capital based on the performance of companies in the digital sector in terms of inclusion. So it's fundamentally an issue of justice, because how just can it be if there's a world where we're creating even more divides by innovating them? So we're creating new technologies, we're innovating new technologies which become the digital divides of the future. So how just can that world be? There are a lot of things that, aside from certain biases in technology, we also, the COVID pandemic has really accelerated digitalization. It's both exciting, the trends that we're seeing, but at the same time alarming, because if we don't arrest those, that exclusivity, those divides, those inequalities, we're not going to be a very resilient world. We're going to see a lot of injustice, which leads essentially to unrest. So fundamental to that is really around technologies of automation, of AI and machine learning, and how that impacts industrialization, the ladder for industrialization in developing countries, especially how it impacts small and medium enterprises and their ability to compete in the global marketplace. So these are things that we have to be cognizant about. But at the same time, there's also a business case to actually be concerned about digital inclusion. For the Global Reporting Initiative, which is a standards body, a business standards body, the telecommunications and digital technology sector have actually defined digital inclusion as a material issue, as an issue that's material to their financial situation. So it's both a justice issue as well as there is also a business case for the private sector and other stakeholders to care for digital inclusion.
Absolutely, Lourdes. I think I want to now switch from the perspective of government and the larger tech companies, and starting with Anthea. I mean, how can we get members of civil society, women, and other marginalized groups included in these decision-making processes that impact their digital and financial inclusion and other policies that really impact their livelihoods and their ability to participate in the economy?
Absolutely. Thanks, Louisa. If there's one thing that I would promote here is that we should have more dialogue platforms, just because the digital economy, I would say, is this amazing new frontier. You know, we haven't had the experiences of decades before us, and there isn't a lot of a huge amount of research out there yet in order to inform the way forward. So here I would say that all these groups who are included in the digital economy, we're talking about inclusiveness. It's a huge amount of stakeholders involved here. And I think this is where a dialogue, transparent, open dialogue is important, especially when speaking to policymakers and other stakeholders. So I would say that also, sorry. So with policymakers, they tend to be often left lag behind the technological innovations that have come out in the tech sector, and it's different contexts and different realities. So the risk here is that policymakers create these kind of knee-jerk reactions, come out with ill-informed policies that provide these unintentional negative consequences or perverse incentives. So the need for communicating, having platforms to communicate the challenges and experiences from all different stakeholders is really important. And, you know, such as the C20 platform is a great example of such a dialogue. And so I think that there's also, from the individual and the organizational perspective as well, I think communication is very important. Building or investing in resources in how to communicate our challenges in a clear way is really important, and to develop, you know, on an individual or organizational level. And of course, you know, communicating in a style where it's still in a constructive and in the spirit of working together kind of way, so you're not deterring or creating more conflicts. I think that is really important. So I would also say that the role of civil society here has an important role in, you know, because they are the ones in touch with their beneficiaries, with people who are impacted by these larger issues. And, you know, if you're talking about a humble low-income woman, they're not going to be thinking about policy issues. They're going to think how to put food on the plate. So as a civil society organization, I think we have the responsibility to translate the needs of these groups in a way where it's translated to the policy level as well. And these dialogue platforms are very, very important.
Absolutely. Thanks, Anthea. I mean, you can imagine a situation where, so long as marginalized communities or someone in a rural community trying to just put food on the table is not connected to the internet and the larger digital conversation, it is a challenge for civil society to recognize her and her needs and then get that into a wider policy debate and open dialogue for government. So there's sort of this catch-22 of how do you include people so that you can amplify their voice, especially during COVID when, you know, it's unlikely people are going to be going into one another's homes or marketplaces to have these types of conversations. Rhonda, I want to ask you from your perspective, I mean, how are you seeing civil society, women, and marginalized groups get more involved in the decision-making processes?
Yeah, let's start first by emphasizing that democratization is important here, because how can you create this public space? How can you build this kind of engagement with the government if the country or the government restricts the civil society work? This will make it very hard. This will make any engagement from the civil society like sound illegal and a violation. So you need to have the freedom of association and freedom of expression, and to be able to build a vibrant civil society. In countries where the public space is limited, you will find like women or youth or any marginalized group very reluctant to express their opinions. But from our experience as well, sometimes the government will be responsive to the engagement and the civil society will not be ready. So how to make the civil society ready? And in many times we managed to get the civil society to government together with government, senior government representatives and parliament members, and the civil society will not know what to say, so they lose the opportunity. So we help the civil society. One of the most effective means is the national business agendas. You help them to identify their issues, and you help them to come up with their own solutions based on their local practices and local culture and their connections at the domestic level. So that's very important. One of the very effective ways is through business associations and chambers of commerce. So you find many business associations representing the small or representing a specific sector. Sometimes they represent women, or even the informal sector have their own business associations. So bringing their voice in a structured way, in a formal document presented to the government, makes the government responsive, because the government is too busy addressing too many issues. So unless you give them a clear document defining the problem and specifying what they need, it's not like in general terms, be specific as possible. So you might find a listening government. One of the good ideas is to build together for the marginalized groups to build together temporary coalitions to promote specific issues, and this is a good way of. And then the public-private dialogue. In many times, the government will form like advisory councils. So get to join these councils, and you will have an ongoing public-private dialogue. But the civil society need to be ready for that move, and the government needs to open up space for the civil society to express their preferences and their ideas, and really be active in the decision-making process without being, like reluctant to talk in public.
Absolutely, Rhonda. I mean, you bring up the point of democratic inclusion, and that's a huge piece of getting the wider policies related to financial and digital inclusion right. And you also bring up the real important role that chambers of commerce, business associations representing different parts of the business community and civil society can play in making sure that government understands the key issues on the ground for different business communities, entrepreneurs, and small and medium-sized businesses. So to that end, I actually want to pose another question to Amit. So, I mean, I think many of us know how SMEs are being affected in the pandemic, but I mean, how are local economies dependent on SMEs, and what are the key issues regarding getting the digital economy right to support the recovery and survival of all these small and medium-sized businesses that unfortunately many of us in our hometown, certainly for me in Washington, D.C., are seeing shut down right now?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's, I think, 3 or 4 different angles to this. One, Rhonda touched on, right, and that is engagement with policymakers, right? In the U.S. alone, and I hate to keep criticizing it, but we've undertaken some tremendous failures here. In the recovery itself, specific to COVID and the pandemic, it is dominated by large businesses. The actual recovery consortia that has been engaged by the federal government has very few small businesses in it. Now contrast that with the fact that 99% of all US companies are small, medium enterprises. So how can we, chart the path to forward growth and economic recovery when you have the vast majority of those impacted not part of the policymaking dialogue? They are, and you look at the chambers as well, the vast majority of the membership are large enterprises. They're not small and medium enterprises. So that's one. The engagement strategy has to change to one that is actually more representative of the economy. The second is in digitization as a matter of infrastructure. To date, we continue to look at infrastructure in very legacy and traditional ways, right? Roads, bridges, electrics, broadband, digital access, especially in rural communities, even in the United States, right? One of the most developed nations where you think everyone's got a smartphone. You still have rural parts of this country that do not have any reliable access to broadband. And if everyone now has gone to a remote learning environment, at least in part, if not wholly, you have a number of kids, a number of school children that are completely without access to their education. And I'm talking at the primary school all the way to the high school level, let alone university and beyond, right? So critical infrastructure must, as a matter of priority, include digitization and digital resources, hardware, software, broadband, and the like, so that digital exclusion is addressed from a critical infrastructure perspective. The third is in the context of SMEs being part of the solution set. And this is where, near and dear to my heart, the financial technology sector plays an important role, right? So if you think about small and medium enterprises dependent on whether they be government stimulus programs or support programs, too often their inability to be financially accessible forces governments to go back to very antiquated tools. Take the US as another example. We were looking at the distribution of prepaid cards and hard checks to individuals and small businesses. I mean, just think about the fraud, leakage, and waste alone in that, let alone the ability to provide those support services in meaningful ways explicitly to small and medium enterprises. And the final piece is, and it was touched on a little bit by Anthea, certainly by Rhonda and Lourdes, is that community engagement now needs to be the central of attention. Communities, right? Because in the pandemic, we have seen community organizations and affiliation groups are the center for vital services. So faith-based organizations, churches, houses of worship, synagogues, temples, etc., right, are places for food distribution, are places for resources. Education, our public schools are equal parts places for education, but for many parts of our economy and some of the rural sectors, including my hometown here in Vermont, is that you have 60+% of the individuals, the kids, getting their food at least 2 meals, if not 3 meals a day from their school. So schools become an important food distribution as well as caregiving for individuals. And so if now you're forced with families that are forced to work remotely, how can they balance that? And so these centers of community engagement need to be tapped in ways much like Anthea was saying. And we have digital tools to do so. Online and social fora that can now create a much greater and secure strategy for engagement. with those community groups as points of distribution and resources, as well as engagement for thoughts on how to provide those resources and what the real choke points and pain points are for small and medium enterprises. And again, notwithstanding 65+ million businesses that are official micro businesses in the world, right? And so you think about this is the center of the new economy, and it's not really new. This has been in existence and it's just been exacerbated by what we've seen in the pandemic. And so I think those 3-4 areas are areas that if we put a concerted view and set of resources to as a priority, I think we can make a real dent in this in a sustainable way.
Thank you, Amit. Absolutely. And I'm curious, Anthea, from your perspective, I mean, how are you seeing, what's happening in Indonesia now with SMEs, and how is the digital economy supporting their survival? And sort of how is digital transformation taking place in the country?
Thanks. And actually, I could not agree more with Amit's statement before, because like in the US and probably in many other countries, the majority of businesses are SMEs or micro small enterprises. And in Indonesia, the majority are in the informal sector. So really, like, we should be paying a lot more attention in enabling this particular sector to access the digital opportunities that have come about recently. However, there are still definitely very much challenges, especially in Indonesia, where I think the recent the pandemic has definitely created this more of a Darwinian kind of atmosphere in businesses. Those who have the agility and who are more best placed to adapt to these new situations are the ones who are most likely to survive. And that's quite scary, because what happens to those left behind. So there are several points in Indonesia that are really concerning to us at CIPS, and one is a low digital literacy rates. If we're talking about rural areas where perhaps mobile data or internet access have only just come up very recently. And the positive thing is that there are more people owning smartphones, but unlike the developed nations, most people can't afford laptops. So so the device and the platforms in which different communities access the digital space should be taken into more consideration. And actually, this is where the private sector has adapted really well, because again, because these groups are also they have a market share or a business case. These are huge untapped groups for a business. And in Indonesia, a lot of the tech companies have adapted their services to cater to these new to these consumption behaviors, to these different access forms of access. Things need to be mobile compatible. Things need to be easily accessed on mobile. Don't even think about making a website on a laptop and things like that, or Zoom. So how we can create a more inclusive environment for micro enterprise and the informal sector is really important here. And also, I think access to affordable internet is also a really good important point to raise here, because you can have access to the internet, but if nobody can afford it, then it's useless. So so then the next step here is, if we want to encourage more economic recovery, how can we make these services, these platforms, more accessible and more catered to the very different contexts and realities people are facing outside major cities and different islands, if in the case of Indonesia.
Thank you, Anthea. The Darwinian atmosphere is definitely a shock to hear, but unfortunately quite true right now. And I also think your point about what type of devices people are using is so important. I mean, in some countries and regions, it's really sort of a mobile digital environment. And in other places, there's, smartphones and people are using, laptops and tablets. Other places, it's primarily brick phones. And so it's really important to understand that the inclusion and the technology or tools created to amplify inclusion meet people where they actually are. And I agree the cost of internet is such a key piece of this, both for the digital inclusion and financial inclusion, which is increasingly in a digital format. I want to now shift to sort of what we're doing here at the C20 summit and think about what actions we want to see policymakers take in order to foster greater digital and financial inclusion. Lourdes, I'm going to start with you. So, I mean, what are you hoping to see governments do starting now in response to COVID-19 and economic resiliency?
Thanks, Louisa. This is actually very timely. I mean, just to share a bit of what we have done in terms of discussions with government, for example, we recently had this roundtable at the UN General Assembly with governments and investors in that discussion to talk about partnership. So the key thing that we're calling on for is to build this kind of coalition of multiple stakeholders. So you have on board governments, both developed and developing country governments. Civil society is very important. And then you have investors, and you have a very well-rounded coalition who is there actually to leverage the findings of what we're seeing from the digital inclusion benchmark and be ready to advocate based on that, be ready to use that as evidence base for their national development planning, for policy reform, for capital allocation, for advocacy, especially from the civil society angle. So a very important call to action from us is really these partnerships. Let us partner. This is in the spirit of SDG 17. And together we can create this kind of environment where the digital sector gets the message. So it's really very important to send that message right and clear that digital inclusion is the key issue and moral obligation of the technology sector for the 21st century, and if we are to recover from the pandemic.
Thank you, Lourdes. I think that's a really interesting perspective, the moral obligation. Before I turn it over to Rhonda to answer the same question, I just want to reiterate to the audience, if you have any questions for the panelists, please type them into the chat box now. And Rhonda, please go ahead. What are you hoping to see governments and policymakers do?
I'm hoping to see a bigger role for the private sector in investment and development of the ICT infrastructure. Governments in some countries with more centralized policies, they tend to sideline the private sector, and the private sector is crucial here. We'd like to see a digital governance reform. This includes the modernization of the state apparatus to ensure better implementation. Cybersecurity is very important, and the very important is the privacy protection laws, and how the government is using the pandemic and the security measures. Do they use it to restrict people and to control people, or do they use it with the intention of giving space to the people, to the citizens? Because I can see a tendency not only in the non-democratic countries, but in democracies as well. They have a tendency to abuse the pandemic and the security associated with the security measures associated with the pandemic, just to control the lives of people. So this should be a concern, and they should use it for the good, not for the bad. But the pillars I talked about is needed for a functioning ecosystem, and we can also add to it building awareness among citizens to engage with digitalization initiatives. However, the pandemic created awareness in the society of the importance of digitization, but it needs to be through like civil society groups and local leaders to bring this kind of awareness. there are still areas that developing countries like Egypt, I'm mainly talking about Egypt, are lacking, such as big data analysis, artificial intelligence applications. This is an area of cooperation between advanced and developing countries. Um, the laws seem so far seem to address physical businesses rather than virtual businesses. So we don't have, for example, any regulations on e-commerce. So that's too late. I mean, we should move forward and have the legal frameworks address the changes in the patterns of business in a timely manner, not to be too late addressing that.
Thank you, Rhonda. You bring up really great points. I mean, one thing is increasing access and inclusion, but that can't be at the expense of privacy or people's security online. Those things need to go hand in hand. Amit, I want to turn to you to touch on this. What are you hoping to see government and policymakers do?
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And I agree with Rhonda. Three really important points there. One, taking off of Rhonda's note. One is government services themselves need modernization and digitization too, right? And that's equally applicable in the developed economies as in the developing economies, right? So if it's going to cost me hours and hours of paper-based exercises to engage services to support my small business or get a SNAP or EBT or public benefit, the inability to engage that is disproportionately impactful to non-digital natives. For, and for folks that would otherwise not be literate in those ways. So government engagement has to be that case. In the emerging and frontier markets, if I have to take a day or two to go to a municipal, provincial, or other authority, the amount of foregone income in an already stressed resource environment is exacerbating. The second is in recognizing that we no longer live in a jurisdictionally bound world. So for financial inclusion, financial access, we have to absolutely recognize, and I know we say this, but this now needs to be reflected in modernized cross-border regulation. Regulation for financial services access, all of the know your customer and anti-money laundering and ongoing monitoring and tracking and reporting are jurisdictionally based. But financial services are cross-border and have been for several years. So we need modernized regulatory compliance that is cross-border in nature, which means two important things. It has to create incentives for self-governance in those networks because you do not have the cross-border jurisdictional oversight and controls. And we have technology today to get to the third point, which is your earlier point, and that is you can provide that access while protecting sensitive public, private information, financial as well as personal, in ways that still provide that access and transparency for the engagement, audit trails and the like, without disclosing sensitive private information in an already cross-border world. So in sum, regulatory oversight and supervision must be equally modernized in an increased digital economy where financial services and the like are inherently cross-border today, and supervision and oversight from a enforcement perspective is not. And secondly, we need to combine those security measures, which is why I come back to risk and compliance as being central. Combine those security measures that really protect consumers and individuals and businesses while providing the access. And today we have those technologies to do that.
Thank you, Amit. I mean, you bring up a really good point about, needing to have frameworks that many governments are following because so much of this is cross borders. But one of the questions we have from the audience is about tax policy, which is very much a national policy. So Cynthia, I want to turn to you. I mean, how is tax policy in Indonesia or the region affecting SME access to the digital economy? And are there anything you'd like to see policymakers do that can reduce the barriers that SMEs continue to face to join the digital economy?
Sure, thanks, Louisa. So here, probably I would first start off to touch on the point of what is the role of government here, and what are the role of policymakers, and in the topic of digital economy, we definitely see them more as the facilitators in creating a more balanced economy and space and responsible space for all these actors to kind of flourish. Because the risk is over-regulation and over-taxation might kill innovation and growth in areas where it might have been possible, where this incredible innovation would have helped millions of people. So, and I kind of understand the strain as well for governments to want to kind of recuperate lost revenues over the pandemic, especially, Indonesian government is very constrained for funds, and governments get their money from taxes. But I think that is a very difficult approach, and I would probably say that we have to be aware that they're not killing these economic opportunities that would have come out of the private sector and would have come out from the entrepreneurial environment in Indonesia that would have allowed them to grow into larger businesses and later down the road provide more tax revenues to the government. So we at CHIPS are very wary of new taxes, especially targeting informal sectors or the micro small enterprises. We are definitely very much against that. We would love to see them understanding that, in order to increase more tax revenues, you're going to have to allow these businesses to grow to a certain size where they can afford to pay taxes, not killing them, before they've even left the door. So so if there's any call to action there for policymakers, is definitely to understand and recognize the role of the informal sector and not kill the potential that is there.
Great, thank you, Anthea. Those are excellent points. We have a question from the audience. So it's, the World Economic Forum has called e-commerce a gender accelerator. Why are women globally so drawn to and successful in online business? Are there other social groups that can similarly benefit? And I think I'll turn this over to Lourdes to start.
Thanks, Louisa. It's not just women who could actually benefit. So you also have, of course, the underlying assumption is that people have connectivity and they do have electricity. But if you don't have those two things, then there's no talking about benefiting from e-commerce without these, as well as financial technology and payment systems that allow it. So, I mean, if you have those in place, then you could just benefit not only women, but also perhaps people with disabilities, people in rural areas, for example, who are far from urban centers of commerce. So there are a lot of possibilities. It's not just women as well.
Absolutely. I mean, marginalized communities and communities such as persons with disability are often excluded from the online environment. And I think that's right that, policymakers and civil society need to be considering how all different groups might participate in the digital economy and in the online world. We have about 7 minutes left. So I actually wanted to ask Amit another question. So, what barriers to financial inclusion persist, and what role do you want to see regulators play, especially in regards to fintech and new technologies that can overcome some of these issues?
Yeah, thanks. One consistent barrier I had touched on just in my last comment, and that is financial regulatory policy oversight mechanisms need modernization, and they need to catch up to the modern operational and access practices that modern fintech companies are employing, because they are cross-border, they are consumer-driven, and they are increasingly peer-to-peer. That is not how financial regulatory oversight has been constructed in legacy architected banking systems, right? That are jurisdictionally bound, have intermediaries, not peer-to-peer, and they stress the issue of compliance versus risk. Compliance versus risk. And so the regulatory reform needs to reflect that modernization. Secondly, from a financial technology perspective, there are attributes of new technologies that provide access and secure transfers of value, which are no longer cash and coin, right? It's data. It's the transfer of data, personal and financial, across internet and online channels for value or to hold that value. So today, any individual or organization could theoretically have an account, a stored value in a bank account or a wallet, hosted anywhere in the world. That is a reality today. If that is the case today, we need an oversight mechanism that is not architected and designed for legacy banks. We need an oversight mechanism that is architected, designed, and dynamic enough to recognize two things: the reality of those operational infrastructure changes, and number two, how they are proactively designed for inclusion. And that's the number three point of financial services regulatory and a barrier here, is that I think we talked a little bit about before. Financial regulatory supervision and oversight is exclusionary in nature. How do I look at Lourdes and box her risk? How do I look at Luisa and box her risk? Transaction sizes, frequencies, amounts, access, things like that. We have to reverse the flow and start including more in the economy. And therefore, the final piece of the design element on modernization is that the test for effectiveness of a secure, compliance-centric financial ecosystem should be tested on inclusion as a part of the effectiveness, not simply do you tick the boxes on all the associated legal, regulatory, law enforcement mechanisms for financial compliance. It should actually be tested for how many more are you getting securely in the system, and therefore transparently engaging more segments of our economy that we didn't. And like I said before, by doing so, inclusion will therefore drive increased transparency and bring down overall systemic risk, which is the entirety of financial services regulation, right? Bring down that systemic risk, increase that resilience and security. And so we have to benchmark and look at successes of financial regulatory policy in that frame versus how we have looked at it from an enforcement-centric view to date. And I have been part of that problem, having worked in the US government, with global regulators, with banking institutions. I've been challenged with that problem. So we're working on creating systems for self-incentivized governance with a consortia-led, meaning private sector-led set of standards that say, you know what, if I'm going to be issuing value, storing value, transferring value, I'm going to want to comply with certain risk and compliance controls. And if I can do so and get more organizations complying with that kind of global standard approach, then you don't have the jurisdiction handcuffs that you do today that are in legacy systems.
Thanks, Amit. That's a great point. And we hope to see elements of government that are focused on digital transformation are also communicating regularly with central banks to make sure that regulation makes sense for today's digital financial world. I want to give Rhonda and Thea and Lourdes about 45 seconds to give a closing thought before we wrap up. So Lourdes, please go.
I just like to use this 4 or 5 seconds as an opportunity to invite everyone to join the World Benchmarking Alliance as an ally. If you are interested and share in the vision of encouraging the private sector to contribute to sustainable development goals, please be in touch. And watch out for the first release of the Digital Inclusion Benchmark this early December.
Thank you. And Thea, please go ahead.
Thanks. I think the important thing is, cooperation and learning from each other, especially in such a dynamic sector such as the digital economy. So we definitely, CIPS welcomes everybody to get in touch with us. We are going to be soon releasing our first policy paper on the digital economy in Indonesia, and it'll touch on so many of these topics that we were discussing today. So if you are in that area in policy in the digital economy sector, please reach out to us. I hope my contacts or my information is out on the website or somewhere, and we would love to hear from you.
Thanks, Anthea. And Rhonda, for your closing thought?
It's not to undermine the civil society role. It's essential for localization, to avoid the implementation gap, to reach out to marginalized communities, to facilitate public-private partnership, and to monitor and evaluation progress in the community. And to do this, democratization is a prerequisite for an effective civil society, so don't ignore democratization. Thank you.
Thank you,
Elisa.
Rhonda. Thank you. And thank you all of you for joining us. And please take a moment to look at the bios of all our speakers and learn more about their organizations. Thank you all and have a wonderful weekend. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you very much.